Hi, and welcome to Far From Home with me, Mabel Ninan, your host. Our guest today is Prasanta Verma, a fellow Indian American, a fellow Redbud writer, and I also discovered by reading her book that she's a Jhumpa Lahiri fan, like me. And for those of you who don't know Jhumpa Lahiri, she's a writer of Indian origin, and you must start reading one of her books. But I'm excited to have Prasanta here on this episode, especially because we are going to be talking about an excellent book, her debut book, Beyond Ethnic Loneliness. Welcome, Prasanta.
Thank you, Mabel. It's so great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I have an advanced copy of the book, so thank you so much for sending this. I could relate to almost every page, and I underlined so many lines. I've marked this book up so much. There is so much wisdom in these pages. So let me not get ahead of myself, and I want to hear from you about your book. But let me introduce you first to our guest. Prasanta Verma was born under an Asian sun, raised in the Appalachian foothills in the South, and now resides in the upper Midwest. That's quite a journey. Her essays and poetry have been published in Sojourners, Propel Magazine, Encourage, Inheritance Magazine, among several other publications. I've only mentioned a few. She served as a speech and debate coach for over 10 years. And when she's not writing or working, she's drinking chai, walking, or reading. And she lives with her family in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Welcome again, and thank you for agreeing to chat with us about your book.
It's a delight and honor to be here, Mabel. Thank you for having me.
Let's start by talking about your background. Tell us about your parents' immigrant journey and how did you become an immigrant?
Sure, I'd be happy to share that. So, my family's from India, as you mentioned earlier. And so, my parents grew up in India, and I was actually born in India. But when I was 1 year old, my parents immigrated to the United States, and my father was looking for more opportunities for work. And that is after the Immigration Act of 1965, when the doors opened for more people to come to the United States from Asia and Africa. And so they were part of one of those early waves in the earlier years after that act was initiated. So they came to the United States and the doors just opened for them to come. My father was educated as a physician, and so that was an inroad for him to come to the United States. And that's how we ended up here in the United States. And yeah. So I was just going to say that, we ended up living in a few different places. We started off in the East Coast with some medical training and then traveled to a couple different places, ended up settling in South Dakota for a while. And then where my father was working, and then my parents got tired of the cold. It was cold, it was snowy, and they wanted to get out of that climate. And also it was a small town, maybe 600 people. So it just felt like, it wasn't what they wanted, where they wanted a little more community and a better environment, climate wise. So that's how we ended up in the South. We ended up living in a really rural, small town. Well, not terribly rural, but a small town in Northeast Alabama.
In your book, you talk a little bit about the partition and your grandparents' journey, even through that period. So, can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, so the partition, it's one of those events in history that not a lot of people know about, especially if you are not from India or Pakistan or Southeast Asia. But at the time of partition, it was actually the largest mass migration of refugees at that point in history.
Hmm.
Now, since then, of course, that we've had many other migrations of refugees, but at that time, it was the largest, where 2 million people crossed the borders between Pakistan and India. And so if you talk to people from India or Pakistan, you will meet many people who actually have a story that relates to partition. And
Hmm.
my family is no exception. So my family actually comes from northwestern India, not far from the border of Pakistan. And so I do have relatives, especially on my mother's side of the family, who came and had to migrate from Pakistan to India. And so that is part of my family story and my family history, is that whole story of migration that some of my relatives had to do and how that impacted future generations. Even today, my mother will talk about that story and she'll tell me that story. And it's, even though it happened a long time ago, it's still part of her life and her experience and her story.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so my dad also has his own story of that as well.
And I love that you mention it because, like you said, even though it's happened to your mother and the previous generation, it gets passed on to us, and we somehow carry those stories, those experiences in our DNA.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. It is like there's a new science coming up. It's called epigenetics, which talks about how these traumas and these histories get passed down in our DNA and we carry them in our bodies. And so I think that partition is carried in so many people's experiences and in their memories, in their bodies, even in their DNA of partition. And it
Hmm.
impacts generations, you know,
Hmm.
on many levels.
Absolutely. Yeah, it does. Now, coming back to you as a little girl, you talked about this, about being the only Indian family and therefore the only Indian girl in this community. So tell us about some of your experiences, both good and bad.
Mhm. Yeah, so when we moved to Alabama, we were in a small town and we were the first Indian family that I'm aware of in that small town. And so, there were people that were welcoming and wanted my family there. And, my dad was coming in with the services of being a physician, with which that community really needed. They desperately needed another person to come and serve there. So there were people who wanted us there, but then there were also others that were, not so sure that they wanted us there. And I share some of those stories in the book. And this kind of experience of being the first, right? You
Hmm.
feel like you're the first, you're kind of crossing over this hurdle of educating people and being a representative of sorts in a way of a people group. This is what people might know of India or what very little they know. Back then, people knew about saris and they would ask me about the red dots on the forehead, and those were the kind of stories that people knew because people didn't have a lot of exposure, especially in smaller towns, to maybe the Indian culture, for example. So the experience was varied, I would say, between acceptance and maybe fear, maybe curiosity, to downright hostility.
Mm, yeah. And so let's talk about the title of your book, because I think what you've mentioned kind of also contributes to what we call ethnic loneliness. How do you define that term? And can you explain a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. So ethnic loneliness, just to backtrack a little bit, so where did it even come from? I have a little bit of a public health background. So I used to work in public health, and a few years ago, the Surgeon General released a report about loneliness in society and how we, especially in the West, but it's really all over the world, we are increasingly lonely and we are increasingly disconnected from each other. And he called it an epidemic. So we're living in this epidemic of loneliness in our society, which is very concerning. But I started thinking too, just about how loneliness not only impacts all of us, but impacts minority groups in particular. Immigrants and refugees and people of color and those who are marginalized. Um, how is it? It's impacting us in different ways. There's a whole level there of experience and another layer to uncover of how
Mm,
that impacts a person of color. So that's where that term ethnic loneliness comes
mm,
from. It comes from explaining the entire structure, the silence, maybe the denial of attitudes and realities that perpetuate this sense of loneliness in our society
Mm,
that specifically affect people of color.
mm. That makes so much sense. And now I can put into words, what I've been feeling. And that's one of the blessings of this book, that it gave me vocabulary, because you named some of those things that contribute to ethnic loneliness. And one of the things that you mentioned, and this is with your experience of living in between cultures, as you call it, people have different expectations from you, of you, right? The Americans have certain expectations and the Indians have certain expectations. So, talk about that. How did those expectations affect you growing up?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, when growing up in the South and being from India, whenever I moved actually when I was a young adult to Birmingham.
Hmm.
And so when I was in Birmingham, I was finally around a few more Indian people. So I was there for college and then post college, and I intentionally sought out more Indians because I wanted to meet more Indian people in my life. And so the interesting thing about that was, and this is true for not just Indian people, but American people too, who would see me and they would see me as Indian. And so, for example, Indian people who met me would start maybe speaking in an Indian language, or they would automatically assume that I knew certain cultural traditions and such, but I didn't because I didn't grow up with that in the US. I didn't have exposure. And unfortunately, I didn't speak the language, right? And then American people, though, the interesting thing is they had the very same response. So many Americans would like, they would maybe I would start talking and they would say, "Oh, you speak really good English." Or they would just assume that I would have knowledge about aspects of living in Indian culture that I didn't have
Mm,
because I had grown up in the United States.
mm,
So just I always would have that tussle, like that tension of trying to explain or explain who I am, right? So I felt like, Indian people, I grew up kind of feeling like, well, Indian people didn't really understand me. And I felt like American people sometimes didn't understand me. So it was this feeling of, well, I don't know anybody like me. I didn't grow up with
mm.
anybody like an immigrant from India who had come when they were a child and they were growing up in the US. So I was the first of my parents, the eldest. So I was the first one to kind of go through some of these things in my family as being the oldest child.
Thank you for sharing that. It made me think of my son too. I think when we go and visit India, sometimes he feels the pressure of having to not stand up to, but meet the expectations of some of, my Indian relatives, because he does not fully feel Indian. And he thinks sometimes that he's representing America to them. But when he comes here sometimes and he's in amongst American friends, they expect different things of him. So I can, through him, I think, relate to your experience a little bit. One of the other things that also contributes to ethnic loneliness is, again, going along with people's expectations, probably, is this code switching. All right, just being different things with different people. And then you mentioned also in another place that it's not that we are pretending, but we can be or drop our guards in certain communities. Like I do, like when I meet my Indian friends in our South Asian Bible study, I drop my guard and I can be who I am in particular areas. But then when I'm doing a Bible study, it's a mixed group, different races and all that. I think I'm a different person. So, can you speak more about that?
Yeah, so when we're living with that sort of, I call it a bifurcated existence or a dual
Mm,
identity, we are constantly negotiating, who am I in this space? Who am I supposed to be? Who do I want to be? What are others expecting me to be? So there's all of these competing thoughts in our head regarding who we are and identity. And so it can get very mentally exhausting
yeah.
and physically exhausting trying to figure out who that should be in each of these different spaces. So there's this tussle with identity, identity formation. And so, as people of color, we go through that tussle because we are a minority group in the United States right now.
Mm.
However, that is going to change. In the year 2045, the United States is going to have a non-white majority population. That means all races combined. All of them like together will be greater. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all of this is going to change automatically, because it's going to take time. Because as I write in the book, it's not just about numbers. It's also about, who has the power, who has the decision making power, who's in charge here. And so all of those things are just going to be rubbing in tension with each other. And so this process that we go through of identity negotiation, it's still going to be going on for a while. But one of the things that I talk about is, and I want to mention this because I think it's important, is we need to have a safe place to land, because this process is tiring, it's exhausting, and we need to be with people who also understand us.
Mm.
You need to also have a place where you can go and be yourself, and you
Yeah.
don't have to explain who you are and what it means. But it also, and some people will sometimes use that as an excuse to stay in an ethnic enclave. So, but we don't want to be
Mm.
there, because we're
Yeah.
not called to be just, in our own little enclaves, in our own little groups. We are meant to be with other people and outside and getting to know all kinds of people. But we also need a safe place. And that is a safe place that we can grow and learn about our identity in the context of being in a safe place.
I love that. I love that because what you're saying is we have to try to find a balance and we need both. We need places where we can connect with people, maybe people like us, our own community. And that in my case would be Indian immigrants or second generation Indian immigrants, those who've been here longer, different kinds with whom I can be myself. But at the same time, I have to also make the effort or welcome if someone else takes the initiative to be friends with me and cultivate those relationships with people from other backgrounds because that only makes me a better person. It expands my horizon and matures me as a human. So I completely understand that. And that's something I tell some of my Indian friends like, don't stick with your cliques, and I know you can actually live in America as an Indian and never have an American friend. You can just be with your community and eat your food and never try anything else and that would be the safest option for you. But
Yeah.
like you said, as children of God and even as just creative human beings, we are called for more and we will enjoy that process even though initially it might be awkward and inconvenient.
Definitely. I love what you said about being creative human beings. And yeah, and when one of the things that we try to avoid that tension, we try to, stay away from it because we're not comfortable with tension. We feel uncomfortable with maybe something that's new or different. But if we allow ourselves to just sit in that awkward place of maybe tension, or it's uncomfortable or it's different, we will find growth
Mhm.
and creativity and fresh perspective
Yeah.
and beauty, and so much that we didn't even know was possible.
Yeah, absolutely. For me personally, I've been enriched by having friends from different ethnic backgrounds. And in this day and age, we are called to be global citizens, like have a global perspective because we are traveling so much and we are going to different places for work. We are going to be interacting with different people for work. And so we cannot afford to not have a level of cultural competency or
Mm,
even an interest in other cultures.
mm,
Yeah.
yeah. And it makes me think of something about what is it, and I use this term, and not in a political sense, but in what does it mean to be a good citizen? What does it mean to be a creative person? What does it mean to be a child of God? All of these I think questions are ones that we have to ask ourselves and answer in terms of our ethnicity.
So thank you so much, Prasanta, for speaking with us. And I'd like to continue this conversation in part 2. So viewers or listeners, stay tuned.